Okay, as you said, the title tonight is Giants of Science, Rediscovering Christian Heritage. Anyway, what I'm hoping to do tonight is, after a brief introduction, look at some people who questioned perceived wisdom. Most scientists made discoveries and pushed forward bounds of knowledge by asking questions. And anyone that's done a PhD knows that's how you get a PhD, is by asking the questions. Asking some questions which are obvious and questions which are not obvious. And these scientists all questioned perceived wisdom of the day, some of it rather dogmatically held. And we'll see, in some cases, what they based their questions on. Then I'll go on to talk about science as an investigation of the Creator's attributes. This is the presumption that there is a Creator, because we're talking about Christians who are believing that there is a Creator. So that's the basic premise. And then finally go on to compatibility of Christianity and science. If all these great men could be Christians and excellent scientists, then is it compatible today? Is the real question. Okay, in the past 200 years, which is the time frame I've really focused on, science has moved forward tremendously rapidly. Before that time, there was very many doubts about, say, the regularity of the universe. People weren't sure if things that held true on Earth would hold true up in the space. Laws were kind of unsure. People didn't know about heredity properly, things like that. And scientific discoveries really have progressed tremendously in this past 200 years. And many of them, as most discoveries are, were against popular thinking of the day. So they really were quite contrary to what was expected. And what I've said is that Christians are among some of the key discoverers, and sometimes they achieved their discoveries purely because they did believe in a Creator God who was ordered and logical. And what they saw around, and what they saw as being common beliefs, just didn't ring true. They didn't see that logical ordering of the universe, and they couldn't tie that in with a sensible Creator. So that's where we're coming from. And what I'm intending to do is go through about 13 scientists, and they will names that will either be instantly familiar, or many of you will know after I say what they've done, who they are. First of all, Johannes Kepler. He's the oldest scientist I've chosen. He is before that 200-year time frame. But he was one who believed that the universe was designed by an intelligent Creator. And the reason that was important to him was because he needed to know that the universe should function according to a logical pattern. It makes sense if a logical Creator creates something, to create it in a logical way. We do that today. We create things, we try to create them in a logical manner, partly for ease of design, but also because it will run more smoothly, it's easier to maintain, those kind of principles. And so Kepler believed that the Creator God did exactly the same. Using mathematics and observation, he worked on the really frustrating problem of the day, which was how to deal with the cycle of the planets. People were trying to work out how the planets moved because they couldn't work out how they could all be circular orbits, and it just wasn't making sense. So Kepler used mathematics and got back to basics, working on the premise that God was a sensible God and a God that was logical, and so applied logical thinking to things, and eventually came up with elliptical orbits for planets. Also worked out that as planets got closer to the Sun, they moved faster, and indeed that planets that were close to the Sun rotated around the Sun more quickly than planets that were further away. And what he said was, we see how God, like a human architect, approached the founding of the world according to order and rule, and measured everything in such a manner. Now, today we might have questions about, well, what about the anthropic principle that, everything is logically ordered because if it wasn't, we wouldn't be here to see it? Well, that really isn't an explanation. That's like saying everything is just because it is. The anthropic principle doesn't really answer anything. It just simply says everything is the way it is because if it wasn't, we wouldn't be here to observe it, which is a circular argument. It's like rowing a boat with one paddle. Whereas what Johannes Kepler thought was this universe has been created in a logical way by a logical God for us to live in. That was his belief. Then on to some more scientists. Georges Cuvier. He was an anatomist and paleontologist. And up to that point where he was starting to work, people would have to find significant parts of skeletal structures to work out what animals they were and what shape these animals had and so on. But he worked out that actually for animals to live, there were certain rules they had to obey to be able to sustain life. So, for example, if you have a bone of a certain length and a certain shape, it can tell you a lot about the rest of the structure that that's attached to. And so he developed this theory that with a very few bones, you could infer things about large-scale structures and beyond, and taking that forward. So this was the principle of correlation of parts. Now, based upon that, he vehemently opposed evolution. He hypothesized that as the correlation was so strongly linked, if you changed any one of those structures, you would have to change basically the whole structure of the animal. And so he hypothesized that you couldn't get gradual changes in one part without changes right throughout the body. So he took that principle and said you can't have evolution on that basis. He indicated that you had to find intermediate forms to really demonstrate that this could take place, because otherwise, as far as he was concerned, you couldn't have that evolutionary process, because you would need to have the whole structure changing. Something else that he looked at was vestigial organs that seemingly don't have a function in the human body. And his comment was, as an essential part of the creation, and they were an essential part of the creation, and therefore had their own raison d'etre, even if we were forced to remain ignorant of it. And some of the vestigial organs they had in those days, in fact, until very recently, we didn't know about some of the functions of some parts of our body. But these have come to light. And Georges basically said, I don't know what they're for, but it doesn't matter. They're there for a reason. And he was one that largely discredited the belief that many Christians of that day had, that extinction, they believed that extinction had never taken place. Basically on the principle that how could organisms become extinct on a perfect creation? And he said, no, the fossil records tell you there are creatures that are around that did not look like the creatures we have now, therefore extinction must have taken place in those creatures. So he did demonstrate that was true. So a scientist who had Christian faith but questioned the thinking of the day, both Christian and non-Christian, and came out with reasoned arguments. Someone close to my heart, being an electrical engineer, Michael Faraday. He, again, trying to go from the principle of a logical creator, decided that he wanted to demonstrate that all forms of electricity were the same. That's static electricity and so on. He used electrolysis to isolate chlorine, discovered benzene, did initial work on thermodynamics, and his work was all based on the theory that all theories must be judged by objective reality. So he was not prepared to believe things unless there was an objective reality on which to base that. And one of his other claims to fame was that he was the head of the Royal Institution. Now, coming from that kind of background with that level of scientific work, pushing forward bounds that people had really never dreamed of, when asked about his speculations on the hereafter, this is what he said. Speculations? I have none. I am resting on certainties. I know whom I have believed, and am persuaded that he is able to keep that which I've committed unto him against that day. As he quoted some verses from the Bible. So someone who firmly believed in the Creator God. Sir John Frederick William Herschel. He was the son of the astronomer who discovered Uranus. So he had a scientific background. And he was very well gifted. Became a senior wrangler at Cambridge. That is, he was first in one of the maths exams there. So clearly a very intelligent person. He's the youngest person ever to be admitted to the Royal Society. As an astronomer, he studied double stars, particularly. He was very interested in these double stars that you would see. Sometimes the double stars would arise because they were just two stars that were in alignment, but other times the double stars would actually be a pair of stars that would be rotating around. And using those, he verified Newton's theory of force at a distance, in other words, gravity. So he confirmed gravitational theory for stellar objects. He looked at Olber's paradox, which basically says that if the universe is infinite, then you should have an infinite number of stars, which would then make the night sky bright. And basically said you can't do that if the thermodynamic principles hold. So identified key problems with that. He recreated photography techniques with the barest of information on how it was achieved. And the slide here indicates one of the early prints of one of his telescopes. Again, he found problems with telescopes, realized that lenses were not particularly good for telescopes, as you got refraction of light, which would split the beams. So he developed a telescope with a curved mirror. Again, clear thinking, logical man. Later on in life, he was converted from a nominal faith to a very much active faith. So this is an intelligent man who, as an adult, had a nominal faith and realized the importance of belief in the Creator God, in Christianity, and became a really active Christian after that point. And the faith prompted him to advocate things like educational reforms in South Africa. So clearly a very intelligent man making a decision which, given he's an intelligent man, seemed to be an intelligent decision. Philip Henry Goss. Interesting character, this one. He sparred with Darwin over the origin of species. He basically believed that, or I'll come down to that in a second, he sparred with Darwin over the origin of species. He was an active naturalist and a member of the Royal Society, produced many volumes on zoological affairs, zoological books, exotic places like Jamaica. Must have been a hard life for him. However, he believed a young Earth theory, and this is where he objected most strongly to Darwin, basically saying that he believed that Adam was created as an adult. Young Earth theory basically says that the Earth was created in 7 days and is no really more than a number of thousand years old. And that was not universally accepted by Christians of that day, then or even now. There are many Christians who would not believe that. But actually, whether we believe a young Earth or not, it doesn't invalidate the belief that God created all we observe. Because God could have, one, created the universe to look old, as he would have done creating Adam and Eve. He created them as adults. Two, our uniformitarian view of geology and dating is wrong, and the Earth is younger than it actually appears to us. Or three, that it really is old, and that the gap theory of Genesis is true. I mean, there are a number of different theories you could think about to try and rationalize this. But actually, it still doesn't change the belief that God has designed and created all that we see. This is not the essential. The essential is to ask the question, did God create? Not necessarily what were all the mechanics, but did he create? Philip Henry Goss clearly believed that God did create and objected with Darwin's atheistic viewpoint on that. Someone else that objected to Darwin, Asa Gray. He was contemporary of Darwin and Wallace, and although he found equally as they had done evidence of adaptation, he resisted quite fiercely, vehemently, evolution to create a new species. And he was torn two ways, because he was also being opposed by creationists at the same time. So you had the evolutionists on one side of the fence and the creationists on the other. Creationists denying that any adaptation had taken place at all. And he was saying, no, there is adaptation, I have observed it. So he had seen that himself. And he took a fine line saying, I observe what I observe, and what I observe is adaptation. I do not observe changes in species. And again, it's like there's the scientific community of today. Whether you're Christian or non-Christian, there are people with different views, and it doesn't necessarily mean that one lot are really stupid and other lot are fine. In this case, Asa was saying, look, from the evidence I have seen, this is what I observe. I do not hold to the dogmatic view of the creationists, and I do not hold to the dogmatic view of the evolutionists. I hold the view based upon what I see, and what I see is adaptation. James Prescott Joule, again one of the people I would be particularly keen on, being an electrical engineer. He was one of the first people who recognised the principle of conservation of energy and matter, and performed extremely precise measurements with actually very, very poor equipment. And he worked in quite difficult circumstances. He wasn't getting support during all these experiments. He wasn't really recognised because he was not in the scientific community. And there was a lot of being in the scientific community in those days. And the reason he only did a few experiments was that actually he felt that after confirming the numbers of, as he called them, the grand agents, they are indestructible by the Creator's fiat. However, someone did persuade him to continue experimenting just to make sure. His view of science is quite interesting. He says, after the knowledge of and obedience to the will of God, the next aim must be to know something of his attributes of wisdom, power, and goodness, as evidenced by his handiwork. It is evident that an acquaintance with natural laws means no less than an acquaintanceship with the mind of God therein expressed. So in other words, he was looking at observing and experimenting and finding out about the world as a way of finding out about the Creator. And this is how he believed that through discovery he learned more of God. He was one of the 717 scientists of the day who signed the Declaration of Students of the Natural and Physical Sciences. And it had been drafted in April '64 by a group of London chemists. And the reason it was drafted was to, and I quote, they were expressing regret that scientific researchers were being perverted by some into occasion for casting doubt upon the truth and authenticity of the Holy Scriptures, and claiming that if scientific results appeared to contradict the Bible, investigators ought to leave the two side by side till it shall please God to allow us to see the manner in which they may be reconciled. So this man clearly believed strongly in his faith and strongly in his science. Now it's notable that not all Christians of the day did actually sign up to that. So there were 717 scientists who did. Herschel, who was a contemporary of Joule's, protested about being signed up to that because he felt it was a religious manifesto and thought this wasn't what a scientist should be doing. So, I mean, like all walks of life, people have different views. But both Herschel and Joule definitely believed in a creator God. Gregor Mendel is the next character. father of genetics. Now, the reason he started work in genetics was that as he was someone who enjoyed his botanics, he was looking at hybrids, and he was intrigued by what he saw. And what he saw was that hybrids just would never remain true to their hybrid nature. And so what he decided to do was try an experiment and quantify it. And he came up with proportions of 3:1 that anyone that's done genetics at school will know about. The fact that if you've got a mix, you mix the genes equally, the dominant one will appear 3 times more frequently than the recessive gene. And with that genetic theory, that basically told him that the traits of a person were inherited from both parents as 2 components, not, as people like Darwin had believed, a blended inheritance. So he was actually questioning some of the really quite strong evidence of the day that there was blended inheritance, and Darwin certainly believed that, but Mendel said, no, that's not what the evidence says. And actually his work wasn't recognised at the time. But the thing was, he believed in the stability of organisms. So he opposed Darwin on that front. He didn't believe that although he saw how genetics worked, that you could go from one creature to another. And he would also believe that God created the world, that blind chance couldn't be responsible for its outcome. That's what he said. Okay, other giants. Let's go on to see who else we've got. Lord Kelvin, or William Thomson as his other name was. He placed Joule's thermodynamic principles into a rigorous framework. So he had his laws of thermodynamics, the first law of conservation and the second law of entropy. And based on that, he opposed both uniformitarian geology and Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. What he said was, the commencement of life upon Earth certainly did not take place by any action of chemistry or electricity or crystalline grouping of molecules. We must pause, face to face with the mystery and miracle of the creation of living creatures. So he saw the creation of living creatures as a mystery, as something that could not be explained by chance. The reason was this law of entropy. He didn't believe that as he saw entropy increasing, as he saw decay increasing within the universe, that you could have effectively growth of information, growth of order. In regards to entropy, he said, we have the sober scientific certainty that heavens and earth shall wax old as doth a garment. In other words, he believed that the decay in the universe is as predicted by the Bible. So that was his view. So again, another great scientist whom we owe a lot to, who believed in a creator God. Someone who, unless you do more mathematical subjects, will probably not have come across is George Friedrich Bernhard Riemann. He was quite crucial in terms of mathematics, developed the theory of curved spaces, and that was later employed by Einstein to postulate his theory of relativity. And he tackled many problems, some unsuccessfully and some successfully. One of the unsuccessful ones was the unification of all major physical forces. Just couldn't do it. He actually drove himself mad trying to do it. But this was a very brilliant man. When he, for his inaugural lecture for a professorship, he was asked to give a lecture, and he said to the person who asked him, well, I've got 3 topics, which one do you want? The person that asked him for the one topic he hadn't studied, which was the geometry of curved surfaces. So at the very last minute, he produced a lecture on this, and the result was Riemann surfaces, which, as I say, mathematicians will know about. These are very important classes of surfaces. In terms of his belief in a creator God, he was a Christian, but I mean, there's nothing terribly remarkable, I would say, that his theories related to his Christian faith. But then that's true of other scientists. I mean, scientists may not necessarily be working in areas that you would impact directly upon their faith. I mean, I work in radio communications. It doesn't impact directly upon my faith, but the fact that I'm a Christian drives me to do good work. And Riemann obviously believed in working hard, as you've seen, and I would say is driven by his Christian faith, but did not necessarily tie that back into there. James Clerk Maxwell. The Edinburgh folks amongst us will all nod sagely at this one. One of our educated at Edinburgh people. He enrolled at the university at the age of 16 and then went off to Cambridge because they could actually support him at Cambridge. He did some very groundbreaking work in my area again, electromagnetic waves. Physicists and electrical engineers will know very much about electromagnetic waves, the basis of all radio communications. He was a bit of an oddball mathematician. He worked intuitively. He guessed at things and very often got signs in his calculations the wrong way round, but somehow managed to arrive at the right answers. It's quite remarkable. But that's the way the man was, very brilliant. His work was validated by Hertz, so we do know it's actually right, and I use it even today. He solved some of the problems of the day. People postulated about Saturn's rings. Were they solid, or were they liquid, or what were they? And he decided that actually they were particulate. They were particles, and that was the basis of that. So this was James Clerk Maxwell that produced this. And that was validated by the Voyager spacecraft. I remember us all being nervous. What's going to happen when it goes into the rings? And this is when we discovered that he was right. He opposed Laplace's nebular theory. Now, Laplace's theory was that the universe had contracted from a gas to form the planets and stars. And James Clerk Maxwell, based on his work, said, no, that's not right. He was also another interesting man in that he felt that Christian scientists shouldn't trumpet their religion, the religious implications of their findings. He felt that you could be a Christian on one side and you could be a scientist on the other, one and the same person, but you did not need to look from your science to develop right through to your Christianity. But clearly he was a very intelligent man who had no complaints about being a Christian. He was someone who was intelligent, made a decision that the Creator God was there, and that was his basis of work. Okay, who have we got tonight? Georges Lemaitre. He was a man who believed that God would hide nothing from the human mind. So, he theorized from the principles of entropy and problems with Einstein's static universe that the universe is finite and expanding. And that is what we believe today. That's how we see the universe today. And he also believed that the universe has started with light, as written in the Bible. And his view of this dichotomy between being, well, it's not a dichotomy, of the two positions of being a Christian on one hand and a scientist on the other, was that actually you can have separated science and religion, but they'll both lead to the same end anyway, was his view. They'll both come to the same answers. Here's the last of the scientists that I want to really explore in detail. Arthur Stanley Eddington. He was instrumental in showing that Einstein's theory of relativity was actually more accurately reflected than Newtonian theory. He did tremendous work in developing stellar theory in star streams. He predicted pulsars without knowing exactly how they were, that they were there. He predicted that if a star was too large, it would explode. If it was too small, it would be stable. And if it was just on the edge, then it would pulse between being stable and exploding. And that's what we have observed today, called CFIDs. He promoted relativity as he believed that was true. He also thought it absurd, and I quote, absurd not to believe in God. He wrote, "In the case of our human friends, we take their existence for granted, not caring whether it is proven or not. Our relationship is such that we could read philosophical arguments designed to prove the non-existence of each other, and perhaps even be convinced by them, and then laugh over so odd a conclusion. I think it is something of the same kind of security we should seek in our relationship with God. The most flawless proof of the existence of God is no substitute for it. And if we have that relationship, the most convincing disproof is turned harmlessly aside. If I may say it with reverence, the soul and God laugh together over so odd a conclusion." That was his view. I could have gone on for ages. I could have mentioned Stokes, developed the theories of polarized light used today. Adams discovered Neptune from watching disturbances in Uranus's orbit. Dana, prolific geologist, who didn't believe the fossil evidence supported one type of creature becoming another. Boole, a mathematician who developed a new type of logic. Morley, who was partnered with Michelson in measuring the speed of light. The creed Morley wrote says, "I believe Jesus Christ shall come with the clouds of heaven to judge the world in righteousness, and that those who have believed in him shall inherit eternal life through the grace of God." I could go on about Pasteur, who rejected the idea of spontaneous generation. And because he rejected that, he developed pasteurization, for which we're eternally grateful. Boyle, Kepler, Linnaeus, Euler, Dalton, Young, Sedgwick, Fresnel. These are just some of the names that I could quote. These were all men that were either Christians or they were influenced by a Christian heritage. And this is what drove them, or many of them, to their work. So, we come to the question then, does God exclude rational thought? Because many people have said you cannot be a serious scientist and be a Christian at the same time. How can that be possible? Right, well, let's conjecture that a creator God doesn't exist for a moment. We have some problems. Where did matter arise from? About 3 weeks ago we had a presentation from an astronomer who was saying you can go back to just after the Big Bang, and you can project forward from there and you can see how everything happens. But what you can't do is get back to that point, not right to the beginning time t equals 0. And because you can't do that, you can't see where matter comes from. So there is a question, from where does matter arise? There are other questions we need to worry about if no God exists. If we're no more than mere happenstance, why do we worry about morals? Morals, after all, as far as I'm concerned, are related to a belief system of value. And how can we have value if we just merely exist? You see, these men were scientists, and they were exploring what they believed was important. And having no God starts raising the questions, well, what is science? It's a study of just what's there. It's back to the anthropic principle, that it's there, it just is. Does it have a purpose? Well, I must admit, if God doesn't exist, then the question must then arise, should I not just simply enjoy life? The Bible says the wisest man alive said that was the logical conclusion. That if there is no God, then I should just enjoy life. Eat, drink, be merry. After this is oblivion, there's nothing. So, that's one side. And that is a belief system. You have to have a belief that God does not exist. That's not a non-belief, it is a belief. So you either believe that, or I would say the other side of the coin is, if God does exist, a creator God does exist, then you have another set of questions. Why did he create us? Would he create an ordered universe? Well, I think if a creator God did exist, and we are a function of that creation, it makes absolute perfect sense that he would create a logical universe, because we are logical beings. How can something who is illogical create something who is logical? Someone who is logical can create something that's logical. How would we know that he existed? Well, you could not prove that a creator existed if the creator is outside the creation. You could look for evidence. And how would you look for evidence? You'd look for evidence in what you see created. This is what these scientists did. They looked at what they observed. They found logic, they found order, they found beauty, they found sense in the world. These are things that you would expect to see from a created God. There's more that goes on from that, but these are essential questions. Science then becomes, it's not pointless, as some would say. Some would say, if you're a Christian, then everything can be explained by God, so there's no point in looking at things. But actually, if everything's created by a logical God, then science becomes an exploration of the mind of that God, of the one who created us. Because as you look at someone's work, you find out about them. We know about an artist from the way they paint, what they put into their paintings, the way they do things. We know about a designer by how they design. We know about a creator by how he creates. And if there is a God, then a creator God who created us, then surely our purpose is to live for him. Joule certainly believed that science was the exploration of that mind, and Joule felt that his work was finding out more about the God that he believed in. So if you're a Christian scientist, what do you do? Well, a Christian scientist, they will look at evidence, as any other scientist will do. They'll propose rational theories, as any other scientist will do. They don't always get it right, as every other scientist doesn't. But they have a conviction that God created us to enjoy his creation and to enjoy him. And actually that gives Christian scientists a real purpose, because science then becomes something really exciting that you're finding out about the person who created you. It's amazing. It's wonderful. And when I think about, as I mentioned, I teach mathematics. I find beauty in mathematics really fascinating. The fact that there is beauty there. That I'm writing these things up, I'm enjoying doing it. And I think, this is such a beautiful system of equations. There is beauty in the world. There is order in the world. These Christian scientists were looking for that. So, what does it really mean? Science is the discovery of creation, and ultimately the Creator who made us for his pleasure. This is what the Bible says. The Bible says that God created the world. He created Adam and Eve for his pleasure, to speak with him, to walk with him, to communicate with him, to be with him. And God loves us. We believe that through the Bible, that the world that we are in is a damaged creation. It's one that is in decay, just as Lord Kelvin says. There's decaying universe. The universe is getting old. The universe is decaying. The Christian believes that is because of rebellion of man. Adam and Eve thought that they were better than God and did what they should not have done. And because of that, we are in the situation we are in. We know the Creator loves us. and we want to enjoy his creation, but we also know that we are not perfect anymore. God did create us perfect. We rebelled, and because of that, the creation is going down the way it is. The Christian believes one final, very, very important thing. They believe that that's not the end of the story. The Christian believes that we know God loves us. God, being a logical God, created us as a logical creation. God wants us to enjoy him. We know that the creation is going downhill, but we also know that God has opened up a way for us to get back to that relationship that we broke when we turned away from him. And we believe, and I firmly believe, that God sent his Son, Jesus Christ, into this world to die for me. That he could take away the penalty of all the wrong things that I have done. And based on that, I can see a God who loves me, and it makes it all the more joyful as I explore and find out more about this wonderful world that we live in. And so I would encourage all Christian scientists, in the same way as the great men of faith in Hebrews would say, since we're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, look at all these scientists that have gone in the past. Let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles the wrong things we've done, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. Many of these men worked sacrificially. They worked to their fingers to the bone for their science because they were driven by the desire to find out more. Let us fix our eyes upon Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him, this is what we believe, endured the cross, scorning its shame, and that he rose again and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. And with that, I'd finish. Okay, in the past 200 years, which is the time frame I've really focused on, science has moved forward tremendously rapidly. Before that time, there was very many doubts about, say, the regularity of the universe. People weren't sure if things that held true on Earth would hold true up in the space. Laws were kind of unsure. People didn't know about heredity properly, things like that. And scientific discoveries really have progressed tremendously in this past 200 years. And many of them, as most discoveries are, were against popular thinking of the day. So they really were quite contrary to what was expected. And what I've said is that Christians are among some of the key discoverers, and sometimes they achieved the discoveries purely because they did believe in a creator God who was ordered and logical. And what they saw around and what they saw as being common beliefs just didn't ring true. They didn't see that logical ordering of the universe, and they couldn't tie that in with a sensible creator. So that's where we're coming from. And what I'm intending to do is go through about 13 scientists, and they will names that will either be and up to that point where he was starting to work, people would have to find significant parts of skeletal structures to work out what animals they were and what shape these animals had and so on. But he worked out that actually for animals to live, there were certain rules they had to obey to be able to sustain life. So, for example, if you have a bone of a certain length and a certain shape, it can tell you a lot about the rest of the structure that that's attached to. And so he developed this theory that with a very few bones, you could infer things about large-scale structures and beyond, and taking that forward. So this was the principle of correlation of parts. Now, based upon that, he vehemently opposed evolution. He hypothesized that as the correlation was so strongly linked, if you changed any one of those structures, you would have to change basically the whole structure of the animal. And so he hypothesized that you couldn't get gradual changes in one part without changes right throughout the body. So he took that principle and said you can't have evolution on that. Okay, as you said, the title tonight is Giants of Science, Rediscovering Christian Heritage. Anyway, what I'm hoping to do tonight is, after a brief introduction, look at some people who questioned perceived wisdom. Most scientists made discoveries and pushed forward bounds of knowledge by asking questions. And anyone that's done a PhD knows that's how you get a PhD, is by asking the questions. Asking some questions which are obvious and questions which are not obvious. And these scientists all questioned perceived wisdom of the day, some of it rather dogmatically held. And we'll see, in some cases, what they based their questions on. Then I'll go on to talk about science as an investigation of the Creator's attributes. This is the presumption that there is a Creator, because we're talking about Christians who are believing that there is a Creator. So that's the basic premise. And then finally go on to compatibility of Christianity and science. If all these great men could be Christians and excellent scientists, then is it compatible today? Is the real question. And so applied logical thinking to things. And eventually came up with elliptical orbits for planets. Also worked out that as planets got closer to the Sun, they moved faster. And indeed, that planets that were close to the Sun rotated around the Sun more quickly than planets that were further away. And what he said was, we see how God, like a human architect, approached the founding of the world according to order and rule and measured everything in such a manner. Now, today we might have questions about, well, what about the anthropic principle that, everything is logically ordered because if it wasn't, we wouldn't be here to see it? Well, that really isn't an explanation. That's like saying everything is just because it is. The anthropic principle doesn't really answer anything. It just simply says everything is the way it is because if it wasn't, we wouldn't be here to observe it. Which is a circular argument. It's like rowing a boat with one paddle. Whereas what Johannes Kepler thought was, this universe has been created in a logical way by a logical God for us to live in. That was his belief. Then on to some more scientists. Georges Cuvier. He was an anatomist and paleontologist, definitely familiar, or many of you will know after I say what they've done, who they are. First of all, Johannes Kepler. He's the oldest scientist I've chosen. He is before that 200-year time frame. But he was one who believed that the universe was designed by an intelligent creator. And the reason that was important to him was because he needed to know that the universe should function according to a logical pattern. It makes sense if a logical creator creates something, to create it in a logical way. We do that today. We create things, we try to create them in a logical manner, partly for ease of design, but also because it will run more smoothly, it's easier to maintain, those kind of principles. And so Kepler believed that the creator God did exactly the same. Using mathematics and observation, he worked on the really frustrating problem of the day, which was how to deal with the cycle of the planets. People were trying to work out how the planets moved because they couldn't work out how they could all be circular orbits, and it just wasn't making sense. So Kepler used mathematics and got back to basics, working on the premise that God was a sensible God and a God that was logical,